By 2030, a single African corporate entity will generate $100 billion in annual revenue. That is larger than the entire GDP of Kenya, larger than the entire GDP of Ethiopia. That number only makes sense when you understand what it was built against. For decades, the math of Africa was deliberately broken. For decades, the math of Africa was deliberately broken. The continent, holding 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, imported food. The continent, exporting millions of barrels of crude oil daily, imported every liter of refined fuel it consumed. The poverty was real. But poverty was never the root cause. The root cause was architecture, a system deliberately designed to extract African wealth and keep the continent dependent on the people profiting from its resources. One man looked at those numbers and decided to dismantle the machine. Not by lobbying foreign governments, not by waiting for policy cycles to turn, by building the industrial engines of a self-sufficient continent from the inside out. To understand where Aliko Dangote is taking this continent, look at what he has already built and what those structures proved. He did not start in energy. He started in cement. Nigeria was a net importer. He built a domestic supply chain that turned it into Africa's largest exporter, operating across 11 African countries today, with 55 million tons of annual production capacity. In Q1 2026, exports grew 71.6% year-on-year. Nigeria didn't wait. Dangote built the supply chain, killed the import dependency, and turned a consuming nation into an exporting one. Then came the proof of concept, the Lagos refinery, the world's largest single-train refinery, Africa's largest fertilizer plant, built simultaneously on the same industrial complex by a man who, by his own admission, had never seen crude oil in his life before he decided to build one. By February 2026, the Lagos refinery hit full production capacity. By March, it was receiving orders beyond the continent, including from regions scrambling for jet fuel after supply chains fractured in the wake of the US-Israel-Iran conflict. The refinery was not just serving Nigeria, it was cushioning the entire region. But those megaprojects were not the mission. They were the template. The blueprint is moving east. And this is where the story gets complicated, in ways the original headlines missed. On April 23, 2026, at the inaugural Africa We Build summit in Nairobi, Dangote stood before the presidents of Kenya and Uganda and made a direct commitment. Not a letter of intent, not a feasibility study, a public pledge to heads of state. I can give commitment to the two presidents who are here. If they will support the refinery, we will build the identical one to what we have in Nigeria. 650,000 barrels. The Africa Finance Corporation's own infrastructure report, released at the same summit, projected Africa's fuel import shortfall will reach 86 million tons by 2040, the equivalent of almost 3 Dangote-sized refineries. The scale of what he is proposing is not ambition. It is arithmetic. The initial location on the table was Tanga, Tanzania, a port city in the northeast, with a pipeline connecting to Mombasa, designed to process crude from the DRC, South Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya simultaneously. President Ruto publicly backed it that day. But within 3 weeks, the picture had shifted. By May 10, 2026, in an interview with the Financial Times, Dangote stated he was leaning toward Mombasa over Tanga. The reason was pure infrastructure logic. Mombasa has a significantly larger, deeper port, a critical variable for a refinery designed to receive very large crude carriers at 650,000 barrels per day. He said it plainly. I'm leaning more towards Mombasa because Mombasa has a much larger, deeper port. This is not a retreat. This is a project in active negotiation, with sitting heads of state on a live timeline, conditional on government commitment from 3 or 4 regional partners. The 4 to 5 year delivery window stands. The scale stands. Only the coordinates are being finalized. When this refinery is built, East and Central Africa will not scramble for Middle Eastern imports during the next supply shock. And based on every pattern of the last decade, there will be a next supply shock. They will draw from a regional energy grid, built by Africans, owned by Africans, controlled from within the continent. Energy is only half the survival equation. The other half is food. Africa imports over 6 million metric tons of fertilizer every year, the majority sourced from Russia. What arrives from within the continent is so unevenly distributed that landlocked nations pay European-level freight premiums to access it. When supply chains fracture, Ukraine, COVID, now Iran, African farmers absorb the shock first and hardest. The Food and Agriculture Organization has quantified exactly what that shock costs. A 10% reduction in fertilizer availability produces up to 25% less maize, rice, and wheat across sub-Saharan Africa, and can trigger food price inflation of up to 8% continent-wide. 80% of fertilizer used across sub-Saharan Africa is imported, often at prices far above European equivalents due to freight, financing, and logistics costs. Africa's smallholder farmers produce nearly 70% of the continent's food. They cannot pre-purchase supply the way commercial farms can. They are structurally exposed to every disruption in a supply chain they do not control. Dangote's 2028 map addresses that exposure directly. A $3 billion agreement with the Ethiopian government to build a fertilizer complex in Gode on the Ethiopia-Djibouti corridor, targeting 3 million metric tons annually for East African markets. Construction begins 2026. Production from 2028. In Ethiopia, 65% of the workforce is in agriculture. Constrained fertilizer access is the single heaviest drag on productivity and on the food security of every landlocked neighbor Ethiopia supplies. By 2028, this plant removes that constraint structurally. The Horn of Africa stops importing the means to feed itself and begins producing them from within. That is not food aid. That is food sovereignty, built on infrastructure no external supply shock can reach. The most consequential part of Dangote's 2030 architecture is not made of steel or concrete. It is made of equity. Every year, $60 billion in African private savings leaves the continent, flowing into London real estate and low-yield Western bonds. Not because Africans distrust Africa, because there have historically been no quality, transparent, dollar-denominated industrial assets inside Africa large enough to absorb that capital and return it at scale. Dangote is building those assets, then listing them pan-African, so the wealth generated by African resources stays in African hands. Dangote Cement is targeting a London listing in September 2026, reporting $732 million in net profit in 2025 and revenues of $3.12 billion. Simultaneously, IPOs for the refinery and fertilizer subsidiaries are being prepared across multiple African bourses, a capital architecture designed to pull diaspora savings and institutional pension capital back into the continent. His projection for the end of the decade? $30 to $35 billion in EBITDA, spinning off $20 to $25 billion in dividends, paid in US dollars, flowing directly to African retail investors, local pension funds, and continental institutions that reinvest inside the continent. Since founding Dangote Industries, he has not taken a single dollar in personal dividends. every naira reinvested. He stated it at the IFC without embellishment. How do we open Africa? We invest our money in Africa. Because if I don't invest my own money, I can never convince anyone that Africa is a good place to invest. But right now, I have a voice. He is not just building industrial infrastructure. He is building the financial architecture that keeps African wealth inside Africa permanently. For 200 years, Africa's economic history was written by outsiders, engineered to extract raw materials and sell back finished goods at a premium. The poverty that followed was real. The suffering was real. But neither was inevitable. Both were the predictable output of a system designed to produce exactly that result. That era is ending. By 2030, 80 million tons of domestic cement capacity across 14 African nations. A mega refinery serving East and Central Africa's energy supply from within, its location being finalized between Mombasa and the broader regional grid, but its construction committed, its financing mobilized, its timeline locked. Fertilizer complexes feeding African farmers without a single import dependency. A capital markets architecture returning $20 to $25 billion annually to African investors in US dollars. All built with African capital. All controlled from within. All returning wealth to African hands. Aliko Dangote is no longer solving problems. He is pouring the concrete for a self-sufficient continent, sector by sector, country by country, from the inside out. Africa's economic future is not a hope. It is not a plea to the international community. It is an active construction site. And the architect, for the first time in 200 years,